Marcus Thompson stood perfectly still outside Buckingham Palace, his red uniform crisp and his tall black hat positioned exactly as regulations demanded. Tourists walked past him every day, pointing cameras and making jokes about the silent guards who never moved or spoke. Some tried to make him laugh by pulling funny faces or telling crude jokes. Others attempted to get him to break his stoic pose by shouting loudly or making sudden movements near his face. Marcus had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 3 years now, and he had heard every joke, seen every attempt to break his concentration, and endured countless hours of mockery from visitors who saw him as nothing more than a living statue. What none of these people knew was that Marcus Thompson was not just any ordinary soldier. He was a former member of the Special Air Service, one of the most elite Special Forces units in the world. The red tunic and bearskin hat were a far cry from the camouflage gear and tactical equipment he once wore in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless classified missions that the public would never know about. He was a sniper, and not just any sniper. He held records that were classified at the highest levels of military command. But Marcus never spoke about his past. The other guards knew he was SAS, but they respected the unwritten rule of not discussing previous service details. To the outside world, he was just another ceremonial guard, a tourist attraction dressed in an ancient uniform that seemed more suited to a museum than modern military service. The truth was that Marcus had requested this posting specifically. After 12 years of active combat duty, he needed time to decompress, to find some peace in a role that required discipline but not the constant life-or-death decisions he had been making for over a decade. The irony was not lost on him that people mocked his current job when it was actually one of the most challenging assignments he had ever undertaken. Standing motionless for hours required a different kind of mental strength in combat. It demanded absolute control over every muscle, every reflex, every human instinct to react to stimulation. When a child threw a ball at his feet, he could not flinch. When someone shouted an insult inches from his face, he could not respond. When the weather turned brutal, he had to remain as solid as the palace walls behind him. Marcus remembered his first day at guard duty training. The sergeant major had explained that they were not just soldiers standing around looking pretty for tourists. They were active duty personnel responsible for the security of the royal family and the palace grounds. Each guard was armed, though the weapons were not visible to the public. They were trained to identify threats, communicate with hidden security teams, and respond to emergencies while maintaining their ceremonial appearance. The physical demands were intense. The full uniform weighed over 30 pounds, and the bearskin hat alone was nearly 2 pounds of dead weight balanced on top of their heads. During summer ceremonies, guards regularly collapsed from heat exhaustion. In winter, they stood in freezing rain and snow for hours without being allowed to show any sign of discomfort. What made it even more challenging was the psychological warfare that tourists unknowingly inflicted. Marcus had developed an almost meditative state that allowed him to observe everything around him while appearing completely disconnected from the world. He could see the faces of people who mocked him, hear their comments about how easy his job must be, and watch them laugh at what they perceived as his inability to react like a normal human being. Sometimes he wondered what these same people would think if they knew that the man they were mocking had once held the record for the longest confirmed sniper kill in British military history, that the hands that now gripped a ceremonial rifle had once steadied a scope on targets over a mile away in hostile territory, that the eyes that stared straight ahead with seemingly vacant expression had once tracked enemy movements through some of the most dangerous terrain in the world. Marcus had joined the army at 18, straight out of school in a small town in Yorkshire. He had always been a good shot, winning local competitions with his father's hunting rifle, but natural talent was only the beginning. The SAS selection process had pushed him beyond every limit he thought he had. Out of 120 candidates who started the course, only 14 had finished. Out of those 14, only 6 were selected for sniper training. The training had been brutal, learning to remain motionless for 12 to 16 hours at a time, calculating wind speed, humidity, temperature, and a dozen other variables that could affect a bullet's trajectory. Understanding the psychology of the target, predicting movement patterns, and making split-second decisions that could determine the success or failure of entire military operations. His first confirmed kill had been in Afghanistan, a Taliban commander who had been responsible for coordinating attacks on British forces. Marcus had tracked him for 3 days, moving into position before dawn on the 4th day. The shot had been made at a distance of 870 meters in challenging wind conditions. One bullet, one target eliminated, potentially dozens of British soldiers' lives saved. But those days seemed like a different lifetime now. As Marcus stood in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, listening to a group of teenagers making jokes about how boring his job must be, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. These young people saw him as a relic, a human decoration with no real purpose in the modern world. If only they knew that this same man could hit a target the size of a playing card from over a kilometer away, that he had once spent 48 hours in a hide site without moving, waiting for a single opportunity to eliminate a high-value target, that he had saved the lives of countless British soldiers and civilians through precision shots that required skills most people could not even comprehend. The afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the palace walls as Marcus maintained his vigil. Another day of being treated like a living statue was almost over. Soon he would be relieved by the next guard, and he could return to his quarters, remove the heavy uniform, and simply be a person again instead of a tourist attraction. But tomorrow, he would be back, standing in the same spot, enduring the same mockery, protecting the same ancient traditions that these visitors came from around the world to see, even as they laughed at the very people who made those traditions possible. The morning started like any other for Marcus Thompson. He woke at 5:30, completed his physical training routine, and prepared for another day of ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace. As he dressed in the iconic red tunic and positioned the heavy bearskin hat on his head, he had no idea that this day would be completely different from all the others. Inspector Sarah Mitchell from Scotland Yard's Counter-Terrorism Command arrived at the palace at 7 in the morning for what was supposed to be a routine security briefing. She had been tracking a potential threat for weeks, and intelligence suggested that someone might attempt to breach palace security during the busy tourist season. Sarah was known for her no-nonsense approach to security. She had worked her way up through the ranks of the Metropolitan Police by being thorough, professional, and utterly dedicated to protecting high-profile targets. When she was briefed about the Queen's Guard rotation, she made a mental note of each soldier's background, as she did with all personnel who would be in proximity to potential threats. Most of the guards had standard military backgrounds: infantry soldiers who had served tours overseas, military police, and various support personnel who had transitioned to ceremonial duties. But when she reached Marcus Thompson's file, she stopped reading and asked for clarification. "This says he was SAS for 12 years, Special Forces. Sniper qualified with classified service records," she said to the captain who was conducting the briefing. "That's correct, Inspector." Thompson requested ceremonial duty after completing his service obligations. "He's been with us for 3 years now." "Exemplary record," the captain replied. Sarah was intrigued. In her experience, soldiers with that level of training and combat experience did not typically seek out what most people considered to be ceremonial positions. She made a mental note to observe this particular guard more closely during her security assessment. As the morning progressed, and tourists began gathering around the palace gates, Marcus took his position at post number 7, one of the most visible locations where guards were stationed. Within minutes, the usual crowd had formed. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders to get better photos. Teenagers dared each other to try to make the guard move. Tour guides explained the history and significance of the Queen's Guard while pointing at Marcus as if he were an exhibit in a museum. Inspector Mitchell positioned herself among the crowd, dressed in plain clothes and carrying a camera like any other tourist. She was conducting surveillance, looking for anything unusual, any behavior that might indicate someone was planning something more than just taking pictures and making jokes. What she observed instead was Marcus Thompson's extraordinary level of professional discipline. While tourists pushed and jostled for better positions, made loud noises, and even occasionally bumped into him, Marcus remained absolutely motionless. His eyes stared straight ahead, but Inspector Mitchell could see that he was actually observing everything around him with the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of combat experience. A group of university students had gathered near Marcus's position, and they were being particularly obnoxious. One young man kept making loud comments about how easy the guard's job must be, how anyone could stand there and do nothing all day. His friends laughed and encouraged him to get closer to see if he could get any kind of reaction. "Look at this guy," the student said, pointing directly at Marcus. "He's like a robot. I bet he's not even a real soldier. Probably just some actor they hire to stand here and look important." Inspector Mitchell watched Marcus's face carefully. She could see the slight tension around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. This man was not unaffected by the mockery. He was controlling his reactions with the kind of discipline that came from extensive military training. The student became bolder, moving closer to Marcus and making increasingly inappropriate comments. "I bet you've never seen real action, have you? Probably never left England, just standing here playing dress-up for tourists." Other visitors began to notice the confrontation and gather around. Some were uncomfortable with the student's behavior, but others seemed to find it entertaining. Inspector Mitchell felt her professional instincts kick in. This situation was escalating, and while the student was not a security threat in the traditional sense, he was creating a disturbance that could potentially mask or distract from real threats. What happened next surprised everyone except Inspector Mitchell. Without breaking his statue-like pose, without moving his head or changing his expression, Marcus began to speak in a voice so quiet that only the people immediately around him could hear. "Son, you're standing in a security zone around one of the most important buildings in the United Kingdom. You've been here for 12 minutes, which is long enough for any trained observer to note your position, your behavior, and your potential threat level. You've made 17 separate attempts to elicit a response from a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, which could be interpreted as attempting to interfere with official duties." The student stopped talking immediately, shocked that the guard had actually responded. The crowd around them fell silent, straining to hear what Marcus was saying. Marcus continued in the same quiet, controlled voice, his eyes never moving from their fixed position straight ahead. "You've assumed that this uniform and this position make me weak or ineffective. You've stated that you believe I have no real military experience. You would be incorrect on both counts." Inspector Mitchell found herself moving closer, fascinated by what she was witnessing. This was not how Queen's Guards were supposed to behave, but Marcus was handling the situation with such professional calm that she could not fault his approach. "You see, young man, the thing about being a soldier is that you learn to assess threats very quickly. Right now, you are not a threat. You're just a boy who thinks that being loud and obnoxious makes him important. But if you were a real threat, if you had approached me with genuine hostile intent, you would already be on the ground." The student had gone pale and was backing away slowly. The crowd around them was completely silent now, hanging on every word that Marcus spoke in his quiet, steady voice. "The uniform I wear represents over 300 years of military tradition. The men who wore this uniform before me fought in 2 world wars, in Korea, in the Falklands, and in every major conflict where British forces have served. Some of them died defending the values and freedoms that allow you to stand here today making jokes." Inspector Mitchell noticed that other tourists were now moving away from the confrontation, but not out of fear. They were showing respect for what they were hearing, perhaps understanding for the first time that the person they had been treating as a tourist attraction was actually a highly trained professional. Marcus's voice never rose above a conversational level, but every word carried the weight of absolute authority. "I would suggest that you move along now and enjoy the rest of your visit to London. But perhaps in the future you might consider showing a bit more respect for people whose job it is to protect the things you take for granted." The student nodded quickly and hurried away, his friends following behind him. The crowd began to disperse, but Inspector Mitchell noticed that their behavior toward Marcus had changed completely. Instead of treating him like a statue, they were giving him the space and respect they would show to any other professional doing an important job. Inspector Sarah Mitchell approached Marcus Thompson after his shift ended that evening. She had spent the entire day observing him and had been impressed by both his professional handling of the difficult situation with the student and the obvious respect he commanded from his fellow guards. Now she needed to have a serious conversation with him. "Guardsman Thompson, I'm Inspector Mitchell from Counterterrorism Command. Could I have a word with you, please?" she asked as Marcus was heading toward the barracks. Marcus turned and gave her his full attention. Out of his ceremonial uniform and wearing regular military fatigues, he looked like any other soldier, but Inspector Mitchell could see the alertness in his eyes, the way he automatically assessed her credentials and positioned himself to have a clear view of their surroundings. "Of course, Inspector. How can I help you?" Marcus replied politely. "I witnessed what happened today with that student. You handled it well, though I'm curious why you chose to break protocol and respond to him," she said. Marcus considered his answer carefully. The situation was escalating and drawing unwanted attention. Sometimes de-escalation requires a measured response rather than complete silence. I made a judgment call. Inspector Mitchell nodded. She had seen enough military personnel to recognize someone who was used to making quick decisions under pressure. "I've been reviewing your service record, or at least the parts that aren't classified. 12 years SAS, multiple tours in combat zones, specialized sniper training. That's quite a background for someone now doing ceremonial duty." "Yes, ma'am. I requested this assignment after completing my service obligations," Marcus said simply. "I'm working on a situation that might require someone with your particular skills. There's intelligence suggesting that a group with hostile intentions might be planning something that could affect palace security. I need someone who can provide overwatch and threat assessment while maintaining their regular duties." Marcus listened carefully as Inspector Mitchell explained what they knew. A foreign intelligence service had been conducting surveillance of various high-profile locations in London. The palace was likely one of their targets, though the exact nature of the threat was still unclear. What they needed was someone who could observe and analyze potential threats without being obvious about it. "The beauty of your current position," Inspector Mitchell explained, "is that you're already in place, already expected to be there, and people assume you're not paying attention to anything beyond your ceremonial duties. You could be our eyes and ears in a way that additional security personnel could not." Marcus understood immediately what she was asking. It would mean using his combat training and experience while continuing to appear as nothing more than a tourist attraction. The irony appealed to him. All those people who thought he was just standing around doing nothing would never know that he was actually conducting active surveillance and threat assessment. "What kind of time frame are we looking at?" Marcus asked. "The intelligence is vague, but we think something might happen during the next 2 weeks. There's a state visit scheduled, which would provide maximum visibility and impact for any hostile action." Marcus nodded. He had been briefed on the upcoming state visit when the security protocols had been updated the previous month. It would bring additional crowds, more media attention, and higher-profile targets to the palace grounds. "I'll need to know everything you have about the suspected surveillance activities and any identified individuals," Marcus said. "If I'm going to be effective, I need to understand what I'm looking for." Inspector Mitchell smiled. This was exactly the kind of professional response she had hoped for. "I'll have a full briefing packet prepared for you by tomorrow morning. But there's something else I need to discuss with you." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your reputation precedes you, even with the classified nature of much of your service record. I've spoken to some people who worked with you in Afghanistan. They tell me you're one of the best snipers the British military has ever produced." Marcus remained silent. He had learned long ago not to discuss his combat record, especially the classified operations that had never been officially acknowledged. "The thing is," Inspector Mitchell continued, "if this situation escalates beyond surveillance and intelligence gathering, we might need someone with your specific skills. Someone who can make precise, long-range interventions if necessary. The implication was clear. If hostile forces did attempt something at the palace, they might need Marcus to be prepared to do what he had done in combat zones around the world. The difference was that this time, he would be protecting British civilians and members of the royal family on British soil. "I understand," Marcus said quietly. "If it comes to that, I'll be ready." Inspector Mitchell pulled out a secure communication device and handed it to Marcus. "This will allow you to communicate directly with our command center without anyone knowing you're doing anything, other than checking the time or adjusting your equipment. We'll have teams positioned around the palace grounds, but you'll be our primary observation point." As they talked, Marcus felt something he had not experienced in years. The familiar rush of adrenaline that came with being given a mission that mattered, where his training and experience could make a real difference. For 3 years he had been content with the peaceful routine of ceremonial duty, but now he realized how much he had missed the sense of purpose that came with operational assignments. "There's one more thing," Inspector Mitchell said. "Tomorrow, there will be a new rotation of guards joining your unit. One of them is actually an undercover member of our tactical response team. He'll be providing backup and additional communication links if needed." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Should I know who it is?" "You'll figure it out quickly enough. Anyone with your background will spot someone with tactical training immediately. Just know that you won't be operating alone." As Inspector Mitchell prepared to leave, Marcus asked one final question. "What's the threat assessment level? Are we looking at surveillance, planning, or imminent action?" "Right now, we're at planning stage, but the group we're tracking has carried out operations in other European capitals. They're skilled, well-funded, and completely ruthless. If they are planning something here, it won't be a symbolic gesture. They'll be going for maximum impact." Marcus nodded grimly. He had faced similar threats before in places where the rules of engagement were clear and the enemy was obvious. This would be different. Operating in the heart of London, surrounded by innocent civilians and tourists, would require a completely different approach. "I'll be ready," he said simply. As Inspector Mitchell walked away, Marcus stood in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace and looked up at the building he had been protecting for 3 years. Tomorrow, his job would change from ceremonial guard to active protector. The tourists would still see him as nothing more than a man in an old-fashioned uniform standing motionless by the gates. They would never know that one of the most dangerous men in the British military was watching over them, ready to use skills honed in the world's most hostile environments to keep them safe. The next morning brought an unusually large crowd to Buckingham Palace. Word had somehow spread about the previous day's incident with the disrespectful student, and people were coming specifically to see if they could witness another interaction with the guards. Marcus noticed the difference immediately as he took his position at post number 7 among the new rotation of guards. Marcus quickly identified the undercover tactical officer that Inspector Mitchell had mentioned. Guardsman James Patterson was assigned to post number 3, but everything about his bearing, his equipment checks, and his positioning told Marcus that this man had extensive combat training. Patterson caught Marcus's eye briefly and gave an almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The secure communication device Inspector Mitchell had given him was disguised as a standard military timepiece, and Marcus tested the connection by sending a simple status update. The response came back immediately, confirming that surveillance teams were in position around the palace perimeter. At 11:30, Marcus noticed something that made his combat instincts activate immediately. 3 men in tourist clothing had been observing the palace grounds for over 90 minutes, but they were not behaving like typical visitors. They were taking photographs, but not of the famous landmarks or architectural features that drew most tourists. Instead, they were documenting security positions, guard rotations, and sight lines. More concerning was their equipment. While they appeared to be carrying standard tourist cameras, Marcus could see that the lenses were much more sophisticated than necessary for casual photography. These were surveillance cameras capable of capturing detailed images from significant distances. Marcus activated the communication device and sent a coded message indicating potential hostile surveillance. Within seconds, he received confirmation that the three men had been identified and were being monitored by additional teams. The crowd around Marcus's position was growing larger and more restless. News of the previous day's incident had spread on social media, and people were hoping to provoke another response. Some were being respectful, but others were trying various tactics to get him to break his ceremonial pose. What they did not know was that Marcus was now operating in a completely different mindset. While maintaining the appearance of stoic indifference, he was conducting active threat assessment on every person who approached his position. His years of combat experience had taught him to identify potential threats through body language, behavior patterns, and situational awareness. At 12:15, one of the three surveillance suspects approached Marcus's position. He was carrying a large camera bag and appeared to be setting up for photographs like dozens of other tourists. But Marcus noticed several things that set him apart from genuine visitors. The man's clothing was expensive, but deliberately nondescript, the kind of gear worn by professionals who needed to blend in. His movements were controlled and purposeful, lacking the random curiosity of typical tourists. Most importantly, he was positioning himself to observe the palace interior through the gates rather than focusing on the external ceremonial aspects that drew most photographers. Marcus remained perfectly still, but he was now tracking the man's every movement while maintaining awareness of his two companions, who were positioned at other locations around the palace grounds. The communication device buzzed with an incoming message indicating that additional surveillance teams had identified more suspects in the area. The man with the camera bag moved closer to Marcus's position, ostensibly to get a better angle for his photographs. When he was within normal conversation distance, he spoke in accented English that Marcus immediately recognized as Eastern European. "Excuse me, could you tell me when the changing of the guard ceremony will begin today?" the man asked. This was clearly a test. The man knew perfectly well when the ceremony was scheduled, as it was posted on signs throughout the area and announced regularly by tour guides. He was testing whether Marcus would respond, trying to determine if the guards might be sources of information. Marcus remained completely silent and motionless, giving no indication that he had heard the question. This was standard protocol for ceremonial guards, but it was also tactically sound. Engaging with potential threats could provide them with valuable intelligence about security procedures. The man persisted, asking several more questions and even commenting about the weather. When Marcus continued to remain silent, the man began taking photographs. But Marcus could see through his peripheral vision that the camera was being aimed at security features rather than ceremonial elements. After 10 minutes, the man moved away, but Marcus noticed that he lingered in the area rather than continuing on like most tourists. This behavior pattern was consistent with surveillance operations that Marcus had observed in combat zones. Through his earpiece, Marcus received an update from the surveillance teams. 2 additional suspects had been identified, bringing the total to 5 individuals who appeared to be conducting coordinated reconnaissance of the palace grounds. The intelligence assessment was being upgraded from possible surveillance to probable operational planning. At 1 o'clock, Inspector Mitchell herself appeared among the tourists, disguised as a middle-aged woman on a sightseeing tour. She positioned herself where Marcus could see her clearly and used hand signals to communicate information about the tactical situation. 5 suspects confirmed. Additional surveillance teams deploying. Maintain normal operations while remaining alert for escalation. Marcus acknowledged the signal with a subtle movement that would be undetectable to casual observers but clear to someone trained in tactical communication. The afternoon brought an unexpected development. The man with the camera bag returned, but this time he was accompanied by a woman who appeared to be his partner or colleague. They began conducting what looked like a detailed photographic survey of the entire palace facade, paying particular attention to windows, entrances, and security positions. Marcus used the communication device to relay detailed observations about their activities. The response indicated that surveillance teams had identified similar activities at other high-security locations around London. Confirming that this was part of a larger operation. As the day progressed, Marcus found himself operating in a state of controlled alertness that he had not experienced since his combat deployments. Every person who approached his position was assessed for potential threat indicators. Every movement in the crowd was analyzed for signs of coordination or surveillance. The tourists around him remained completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. They continued to take photographs, make jokes, and treat the guards as tourist attractions. Some even commented about how boring it must be to stand in one place all day with nothing to do. If only they knew that the man they were mocking was simultaneously tracking multiple potential threats, maintaining communication with elite counterterrorism teams, and preparing for the possibility that he might need to use lethal force to protect them and the royal family. At 4:30, Marcus received a priority message through the communication device. Intelligence indicated that the suspects were likely conducting final reconnaissance for an operation planned during the upcoming state visit. The threat level was being elevated to imminent, and tactical response teams were moving into position. As his shift ended and he was relieved by the next guard, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his situation had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, he had been a ceremonial guard whose biggest challenge was dealing with rude tourists. Today, he was back in the role he knew best, a soldier preparing to protect innocent people from those who wished them harm. The difference was that this time, the people he was protecting had no idea they needed protection, and the enemy was hiding among them, disguised as harmless tourists with cameras. Marcus Thompson moved with precision that would have been invisible to anyone watching. While maintaining his ceremonial stance, he accessed the concealed sidearm that was part of the Queen's Guard emergency equipment. The weapon was small, compact, and designed for close-range protection. But Marcus had trained extensively with similar firearms during his SAS service. The primary suspect was now 40 meters away, raising his assault weapon toward the palace balcony where the royal family stood waving to the crowd. Marcus had perhaps 3 seconds before the man would be in position to fire. In those 3 seconds, Marcus made calculations that would have taken most people several minutes with pencil and paper. Wind speed was minimal. The target was moving slowly and predictably. The angle was challenging but manageable. Most importantly, there were dozens of innocent civilians between Marcus and the suspect, requiring absolute precision to avoid causing casualties among the people he was trying to protect. Marcus drew his weapon in one fluid motion that appeared to be nothing more than adjusting his ceremonial equipment. The tourists around him continued cheering and taking photographs, completely unaware that lethal combat was about to erupt around them. Through his peripheral vision, Marcus could see Inspector Mitchell's tactical teams moving to intercept the other suspects, but they were still too far away to reach the primary threat in time. Everything depended on Marcus making an impossible shot while surrounded by innocent people who thought they were witnessing a peaceful royal ceremony. The suspect had his weapon fully assembled and was bringing it to his shoulder. Marcus could see the man's finger moving toward the trigger. There was no more time for calculation or hesitation. Marcus fired a single shot. The bullet traveled the 40 meters between Marcus and the suspect in less than 1/10 of a second. It struck the man's center mass, precisely where Marcus had aimed to ensure immediate incapacitation without the risk of overpenetration that could harm civilians. The suspect collapsed instantly, his weapon falling harmlessly to the ground. The tourists around him initially thought he had suffered a medical emergency, and several people moved to help him before realizing what had actually happened. The sound of the gunshot caused immediate confusion in the crowd. Most people had no idea where it had come from or what was happening. Some began screaming and running, while others looked around frantically, trying to understand the source of the disturbance. Marcus had already holstered his weapon and resumed his ceremonial position before most people realized a shot had been fired. To casual observers, he appeared to be the same motionless guard he had been all morning, showing no reaction to the chaos erupting around him. Through his communication system, Marcus received confirmation that tactical teams had successfully intercepted 3 other suspects before they could deploy their weapons. 2 additional suspects were still unaccounted for, and the operation was continuing. Inspector Mitchell's voice came through the earpiece with urgent instructions. Outstanding shot, Thompson. Primary threat neutralized. Maintain position and watch for secondary threats. The remaining suspects may attempt to escape or escalate. The royal family had been immediately moved to safety inside the palace as soon as the first shot was fired. Following established security protocols, the crowd was being evacuated in an organized manner by uniformed police who had been positioned around the perimeter for exactly this type of emergency. Marcus continued his surveillance while maintaining his ceremonial appearance. Despite the chaos around him, many tourists were still taking photographs and asking questions about what had happened, not realizing that the silent guard they were standing near had just prevented what could have been a catastrophic assassination attempt. 10 minutes after the shooting, Marcus spotted one of the remaining suspects attempting to blend in with the evacuating crowd. The man was moving too quickly and purposefully, and he kept looking back toward the palace rather than focusing on escape like a genuine tourist. Marcus activated his communication system and provided detailed information about the suspect's location and movement pattern. Within seconds, plainclothes officers moved to intercept the man before he could reach the street. As the immediate crisis passed, Marcus found himself thinking about the extraordinary circumstances that had led to this moment. 3 hours earlier, he had been just another ceremonial guard dealing with tourist crowds. Now he had prevented a major terrorist attack and potentially saved the lives of the royal family and dozens of innocent civilians. The suspect he had shot was being treated by paramedics and would survive to face prosecution, which had been Marcus's intention. His years of training had taught him to use exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize a threat without causing unnecessary harm. Inspector Mitchell appeared at Marcus's position as the area was being secured by additional security personnel. She was trying to maintain the appearance of a tourist, but Marcus could see the relief and professional satisfaction in her expression. "The situation is contained," she said quietly, positioning herself as if she were taking a photograph of him. "All 7 suspects are in custody. No casualties among civilians or royal family members. Your intervention was decisive." Marcus nodded slightly, the only acknowledgement he could make while maintaining his ceremonial role. Around them, the evacuation was proceeding smoothly, with most tourists assuming this had been a precautionary security measure rather than a response to an actual attack. "The remarkable thing," Inspector Mitchell continued, "is that most people will never know what really happened here today. They'll remember it as the day there was some kind of security scare during a royal ceremony. They'll never know that a ceremonial guard prevented what could have been one of the worst terrorist attacks in British history." As the crowd thinned and normal security protocols were restored, Marcus reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. For 12 years he had served in combat zones around the world, using his skills to protect British interests and save lives. Then he had sought peace and anonymity in ceremonial duty, only to find himself back in combat when it mattered most. The difference was that this time, the people he had protected would never know they had needed protection. They would go home and tell their families about the day they visited Buckingham Palace and saw the royal family on the balcony. Some might mention the brief security scare that interrupted the ceremony. None of them would know that the silent man in the red uniform, the one they had been making jokes about and treating as a tourist attraction, had risked everything to keep them safe. They would never know that in the space of a few seconds, one of the most highly trained snipers in the British military had proven that ceremonial duty and operational readiness were not mutually exclusive. As Marcus maintained his position through the rest of his shift, he realized that tomorrow he would be back to being just another guard for tourists to photograph and mock. But today had reminded him why he had chosen to serve, and why the skills he had developed in the world's most dangerous places would always be ready when innocent people needed protection. 3 weeks after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Marcus Thompson stood at his familiar position at post number 7, but everything had changed in ways that the tourists around him could never imagine. The official story released to the media had described a security exercise that had required temporary evacuation of the palace grounds. No mention was made of the assassination attempt or Marcus's role in preventing it. The 7 suspects had been quietly transferred to high-security facilities where they would face terrorism charges under laws that allowed for prosecution without revealing sensitive details about intelligence operations or security procedures. Their identities and the full scope of their planned attack would remain classified to protect ongoing counter-terrorism operations. Inspector Mitchell had visited Marcus several times since the incident, both for official debriefings and to check on his psychological state. After returning to lethal combat after 3 years of peaceful duty, what she found was a man who had processed the experience with the same professional calm he brought to all aspects of his military service. The thing that impressed me most, she had told her superiors in her after-action report, was that Thompson never broke character even while engaging the primary threat. Tourists standing 5 meters away had no idea that an armed confrontation had just taken place. That level of tactical discipline under extreme stress is extraordinary. The crowds around Marcus's position were larger than ever now, though for reasons that amused him greatly. Word had spread on social media about various incidents involving the Queen's guards, and tourists were coming specifically hoping to provoke some kind of dramatic response. They had no idea that they were trying to get a reaction from someone who had recently prevented a major terrorist attack while maintaining perfect ceremonial composure. Marcus watched a group of university students gathering near his position, clearly planning some kind of stunt designed to make him break his stoic pose. Their leader was carrying a portable speaker and seemed to be preparing some kind of loud musical performance that he thought would force Marcus to react. What these young people did not understand was that after surviving firefights in Afghanistan, conducting covert operations in hostile territories, and recently engaging armed terrorists in the heart of London, their amateur attempts to disturb his concentration were less challenging than a gentle breeze. The student with the speaker began playing loud, obnoxious music and dancing around Marcus's position, encouraged by his friends and a gathering crowd of onlookers. Some tourists were clearly embarrassed by the display, while others seemed to find it entertaining. Marcus remained perfectly still and silent, but his mind was active in ways these people could never imagine. He was automatically conducting threat assessment on everyone in the area, identifying potential escape routes, and maintaining situational awareness that extended far beyond the immediate disturbance. After 10 minutes of increasingly desperate attempts to get a reaction, the student gave up and moved away, disappointed that his performance had failed to achieve its goal. As the crowd began to disperse, an elderly man approached Marcus's position. "Son, I just wanted to say thank you," the man said quietly, positioning himself as if he were simply pausing to rest near the guard post. Marcus recognized him immediately. This was Colonel James Hartley, retired, who had served as Marcus's commanding officer during his first deployment in Afghanistan 8 years earlier. The colonel was now working in an advisory capacity with the Ministry of Defense, and his presence here was clearly not coincidental. "I've been briefed on recent events," Colonel Hartley continued in a voice so low that only Marcus could hear. "Outstanding performance under impossible circumstances. You've upheld the finest traditions of the regiment and the Special Forces community." Marcus could not acknowledge the colonel's presence without breaking protocol, but he felt a deep sense of satisfaction at having his actions recognized by someone who understood exactly what had been required and accomplished. "There's something else I wanted to tell you," Colonel Hartley said, pretending to check his watch while speaking. "Your actions here have come to the attention of people at the highest levels of government. There are discussions about returning you to active special operations, possibly with a specialized unit focused on domestic counter-terrorism." This was news that Marcus had not expected. He had assumed that his intervention during the palace incident would be noted in his file and forgotten. Just another classified event that would never be publicly acknowledged. "The decision is entirely yours," Colonel Hartley continued. "You could remain in ceremonial duty, which everyone now understands serves a dual purpose of providing elite security coverage in a completely covert manner. Or you could return to the operational world with enhanced responsibilities and clearance levels." Marcus thought about the choice he was being offered. 3 years of ceremonial duty had provided him with the peace and stability he had needed after 12 years of continuous combat operations. But the recent events had reminded him how much he missed the sense of purpose that came with protecting people who could not protect themselves. "Take your time deciding," Colonel Hartley said as he prepared to move away. "But know that your country is proud of what you accomplished here, even if it can never be publicly acknowledged." As the colonel walked away, Marcus reflected on the strange trajectory his life had taken. He had come to ceremonial duty seeking anonymity and routine. Instead, he had found himself using his most elite skills to prevent a catastrophe that could have changed the course of British history. The tourists around him continued their attempts to provoke reactions, completely unaware that they were in the presence of someone who had proven himself capable of split-second decisions under the most extreme pressure imaginable. They saw him as a quaint relic of bygone military traditions, a living statue whose only purpose was to provide photo opportunities and entertainment. What they could not see was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting people who would never know they needed protection. Someone who had voluntarily taken on the most demanding and dangerous assignments the military could offer, and who had proven that true strength often meant appearing weak to those who lacked the understanding to recognize real capability. As his shift ended and he was relieved by the next guard, Marcus made his decision about the choice Colonel Hartley had offered him. Whether he remained in ceremonial duty or returned to active operations, he would continue doing what he had always done, standing ready to protect innocent people from threats they could not see or understand. The mockery and jokes from tourists no longer bothered him at all. He had learned that being underestimated could be the greatest tactical advantage of all. In a world where real threats often came disguised as harmless, everyday activities, there was tremendous value in being the person no one suspected was capable of extraordinary action. Marcus Thompson walked back to his quarters, knowing that tomorrow he would return to his post, where tourists would continue to see him as nothing more than a silent figure in an old-fashioned uniform. They would never know that they were under the protection of one of the most lethal and dedicated soldiers the British military had ever produced. And that was exactly how he preferred it.